The sunlight sliced through the tinted windows of the Bentley, casting golden rectangles across Victor Reed's tailored suit. He adjusted his platinum cufflinks, a habit from his days when he couldn't afford even the cheapest accessories, and checked his watch. 10 minutes until the scheduled photo opportunity. The publicity team had timed it precisely. Arrive at the nursing home, hand over the check, smile for the cameras, and be back in time for the conference call with Tokyo. Simple, efficient, like everything in his life. "We're here, sir," his driver announced, pulling up to a small, dilapidated building that seemed to shrink beneath the weight of neglect. Victor frowned. This wasn't what he expected. His charitable foundation typically selected more photogenic institutions. He made a mental note to speak with his PR director about the choice. "Wait here," he instructed, stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The nursing home's exterior was a patchwork of peeling paint and cracked windows. A faded sign reading Pine Haven's Senior Living hung crookedly above the entrance. As Victor approached, he caught the scent of disinfectant mingling with something less clinical, the unmistakable smell of abandonment. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow on the worn linoleum. A young woman at the reception desk looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of his immaculate suit and the leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained a large check. "Mr. Reed, we weren't expecting you for another 10 minutes, she stammered, quickly smoothing her hair. "I prefer to be early," he replied, his voice carrying the practiced warmth he reserved for these occasions. "Perhaps you could show me around before the photographers arrive." She nodded eagerly, emerging from behind the desk. "Of course, I'm Nancy, the activities coordinator. We're so grateful for your foundation's interest in our little facility." As Nancy led him down the corridor, Victor maintained his professional smile, though his eyes registered everything. The threadbare carpet, the chipping paint, the ancient television set around which a handful of elderly residents gathered. This place needed far more than the $25,000 his foundation had allocated. They passed an open door where an old man sat motionless, staring at a photo frame clutched in gnarled hands. Further down, 2 women with snow-white hair played checkers, their movements deliberate and slow, as if conserving energy for the game alone. "This is our common area," Nancy explained, gesturing to a room where sunlight streamed through dusty windows. Several residents occupied chairs arranged along the walls, some dozing, others gazing vacantly at nothing in particular. And that's when he saw her. She sat alone by the window, silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her thin fingers tracing patterns on an open book in her lap. Something about her profile, the proud tilt of her chin, the contemplative curve of her mouth, froze Victor in place. A memory surfaced, buried beneath decades of ambition and achievement. "Who is that woman?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. Nancy followed his gaze. "Oh, that's Miss Grace Wilson. She's been with us about 5 years now, former schoolteacher. Keeps to herself, mostly, but always kind. Would you like to meet her?" Victor couldn't respond. His heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the window, drawn by an invisible thread from his past. The woman turned slightly, and sunlight illuminated her face. The same face that had smiled at him across a classroom 30 years ago, that had wiped away his tears when the other children mocked his second-hand clothes, that had slipped him extra food when she noticed he hadn't brought lunch. "Miss Grace," he whispered. The woman looked up, confusion rippling across her weathered features. Then her eyes, still that remarkable shade of hazel, widened in shock. "Victor," she breathed, book sliding forgotten from her lap. "Little Victor Reed." He fell to his knees beside her chair, throat constricting with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "You remember me?" Her trembling hand reached out to touch his face, as if confirming he wasn't an apparition. "How could I forget my brightest star?" A tear slipped down her cheek. "Look at you, all grown up and so successful." Victor struggled to speak past the lump in his throat. His mind raced through memories. Miss Grace staying late to help him with math, defending him against bullies, quietly supplying him with school materials his widowed father couldn't afford. After his father died during his first year of college, she had been the one to call weekly, to send care packages, to believe in him when no one else did. And how had he repaid her? By getting too busy, by letting calls go unanswered, by promising visits that never materialized as he built his empire. "What are you doing here?" he finally managed. She smiled, but the expression couldn't mask the weariness in her eyes. "Oh, life happens, dear. I never married, never had children. When the arthritis got too bad to teach, there wasn't much left. The pension only stretches so far." Victor looked around the room with new eyes, at the cracked ceiling tiles, the outdated medical equipment, the lonely figures hunched in chairs, and felt shame crash over him like a wave. All his success, his multiple homes, his private jets, his billions, and the woman who had shaped his life, who had loved him like a son, was living in this forgotten place. "Miss Grace," he said, taking her frail hands in his, "I'm taking you home. If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you." Continuing. Nancy reappeared at his side, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Reed, the photographers are here. Shall we proceed with the—" "Cancel it," Victor interrupted, not taking his eyes off Miss Grace. I'm sorry?" "Cancel the photo op and double the donation." He finally turned to face the startled coordinator. "In fact, call my office. I want a full assessment of what this place needs. Staffing, renovations, equipment, everything." Nancy blinked rapidly. "That's incredibly generous, but—" "And I need a wheelchair," Victor continued. "Miss Wilson is coming with me today." Grace's eyes widened. "Victor, no. I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he said softly, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Let me do this. Let me take care of you the way you once took care of me." Behind him, the nursing home staff exchanged confused glances. The PR team hovered uncertainly near the entrance, cameras unused. None of them recognized the transformation happening before their eyes. Victor Reed, notorious for his ruthless business tactics and carefully curated public image, was kneeling beside an elderly teacher, tears streaming unchecked down his face. For the first time in decades, he wasn't calculating the return on investment. He was simply a boy again, facing the woman who had shown him what it meant to be truly seen. Grace studied his face for a long moment, then nodded almost imperceptibly. "All right, Victor. Just for a little while." He helped her gather her few belongings, a photo album, several paperback books, a hand-knitted shawl, into a small suitcase that contained her entire life. The reality of her existence compared to his opulence struck him with physical force. As he wheeled her toward the exit, past the murmuring staff and bewildered photographers, Grace reached up to touch his hand. "I always knew you would do great things," she said softly. "Always." Victor swallowed hard. What good were great things if he had forgotten the greatest lesson she had taught him? That success meant nothing without compassion, without remembering where you came from and who helped you along the way. Outside, his driver hurried to open the Bentley's door, surprise flickering across his professional expression at the sight of the elderly woman in the wheelchair. Victor gently helped Grace into the car, then paused before getting in himself. The nursing home stood against the grey sky, housing dozens more just like her, forgotten, discarded, alone. In that moment, he made a silent vow that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. The drive back to his penthouse was silent. Grace gazed out the window, eyes drinking in the city that had changed so dramatically since her youth. Victor watched her, seeing for the first time the toll that years of neglect had taken, the slight tremor in her hands, the careful way she held herself as if in constant pain. How had he let this happen? How had he forgotten the one person who never forgot him? The first thing Grace said when they entered his lavish penthouse was, "Where are your books, Victor?" The question caught him off guard. He glanced around the minimalist space, all chrome, glass, and abstract art, selected by his interior designer. I read mostly on tablets now." She nodded, but he saw the disappointment in her eyes. This woman, who had nurtured his love of literature, who had slipped him worn paperbacks of adventures and possibilities, was looking at a home devoid of the very magic she had instilled in him. "I'll have books brought in tomorrow," he promised, suddenly desperate to see her smile. "Again, any titles you want." Grace moved slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "It's not about what I want, Victor," she said quietly. "It's about what you've forgotten." Her words pierced him more deeply than any business rival's criticism ever had. What else had he forgotten in his relentless pursuit of success? That night, after settling Grace in the guest suite, after calling his assistant to arrange for a nurse and doctor, after ordering every book he could remember her recommending to him as a child, Victor sat alone in his study and wept. Will Grace accept Victor's help, or will her pride stand in the way? And what long-buried memories will surface as these two souls reconnect after decades apart? The morning sun filtered through the bedroom curtains, casting gentle shadows across Grace's sleeping form. Victor stood in the doorway, a tray of breakfast in his hands, watching the rise and fall of her chest. In sleep, the years seemed to fall away from her face, revealing glimpses of the vibrant teacher who had once commanded a classroom with quiet authority. He had barely slept, spending hours instead digging through storage units until he found what he was looking for, a battered cardboard box containing relics from his childhood. Inside were the books she had given him, dog-eared and annotated in his adolescent handwriting, report cards with her encouraging comments, even a Christmas card she'd sent during his first year of college, with $20 enclosed. Probably a significant portion of her teacher's salary at the time. The $20 that he had never acknowledged receiving, too busy with his new life to send a thank-you note. Grace stirred, eyes fluttering open. For a moment, confusion clouded her face as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Then, her gaze found Victor, and recognition dawned. "I thought I might have dreamed it all," she said, voice rough with sleep. He approached, setting the tray carefully on the bedside table. "No dream. Good morning, Miss Grace." She smiled at the formal address, a throwback to their classroom days. "Good morning, Victor." Her eyes took in the elegant room, the expensive furnishings. "This is quite a change from Pinehaven." "I hope it's a welcome one," he replied, helping her sit up against the pillows. "I've arranged for a doctor to see you today, and a nurse will be coming to help with anything you need." Grace accepted the cup of tea he offered, but her expression grew troubled. "Victor, you don't need to do all this. I'm just one old woman. Surely your life is too busy for—" "My life has been too busy for too long," he interrupted gently. "And you're not just anything, Miss Grace. You're the reason I have this life at all." She studied him over the rim of her teacup. "Tell me about your life, Victor. The real parts, not what I could read in a magazine profile." The request was so simple, yet it stripped him bare. When was the last time anyone had asked about the real parts of his life? His associates, his employees, even his few friends, they all related to the persona he had crafted, the successful businessman whose ruthless efficiency was legendary in the corporate world. And so, sitting beside her bed as the morning light strengthened, Victor found himself talking, really talking, for the first time in years. He told her about the loneliness of success, about the relationship sacrificed to ambition, about the emptiness that sometimes woke him in the middle of the night despite all he had achieved. Grace listened without judgment, occasionally asking a question that cut straight to the heart of matters he hadn't fully acknowledged even to himself. By the time he fell silent, the breakfast had grown cold, and he felt oddly lighter, as if he'd set down a burden he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "You've built an impressive life, Victor," she finally said, reaching out to pat his hand. "But a house isn't the same as a home, is it?" Her words struck him like a physical blow. He had 5 houses across the globe, each more spectacular than the last, yet none of them felt like home. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed insistently. The Tokyo call. He had completely forgotten. Excusing himself, he stepped into the hallway to deal with the business that had once been his sole focus. By the time he returned, a nurse had arrived and was helping Grace prepare for the day. Victor retreated to his office, mind churning, with unfamiliar emotions and half-formed plans. Throughout the day, as he moved through his usual schedule of meetings and conference calls, Victor found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to Grace. The doctor had visited and delivered a sobering assessment. Years of inadequate care had taken their toll. Her arthritis was severe, her blood pressure dangerously high, and her heart showed signs of strain. With proper treatment, nutrition, and care, we can improve her quality of life, the doctor had explained. But you should be prepared for the reality that at her age, and with her medical history, he hadn't needed to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Victor hadn't found her in time to undo all the damage of the years. That evening, he cancelled his dinner meeting and returned home early, finding Grace sitting in his living room, surrounded by the books he'd had delivered, thousands of volumes that now lined previously empty shelves. "You didn't have to buy out an entire bookstore," she said with a smile that didn't quite mask her fatigue from the day's medical examinations. "I wanted you to feel at home," he replied simply. "That's not how it works, dear." She patted the sofa beside her. "Homes aren't built with things. They're built with people, with memories, with love." Victor sat beside her, suddenly feeling like the awkward boy he'd once been, desperate for guidance. "I don't know if I remember how to do that anymore." Grace opened a leather-bound photo album on her lap, one of the few possessions she'd brought from the nursing home. "Then perhaps it's time for a refresher course." Together, they paged through decades of her life, stopping at a black-and-white photograph of a classroom from 30 years ago. There he was, skinny and serious-faced, standing beside his science fair project, while Grace beamed proudly beside him. "You kept this?" he asked, throat tight. "I kept everything," she replied softly. "Every newspaper clipping when your company went public, every magazine mention. I followed your rise, Victor, even when you stopped returning my calls." There was no accusation in her voice, only a gentle sadness. Shame washed over him. I thought you wouldn't want to hear from me after I dropped out of college to start the business. You always emphasized education so strongly." Grace laughed, a warm, rich sound that transported him back to childhood. "Oh, Victor, I emphasized learning, not degrees. There's a difference." She touched the photo gently. "I never expected you to live the life I planned for you. I only ever wanted you to live a life that brought you joy. Has your life truly brought you joy, Victor, or merely success? Have you ever experienced or know someone who has experienced a moment of recognition about what truly matters in life? Let us know in the comments." The days stretched into weeks, and Victor found himself making unprecedented changes to his schedule. He delegated meetings, postponed trips, rearranged priorities to spend more time at home. His executive team was baffled by the transformation, but he offered no explanations for his sudden interest in work-life balance. Grace's health improved somewhat under proper medical care. Color returned to her cheeks, and on good days she moved around the penthouse, with the help of a walker, rearranging books and adding small touches that gradually transformed the sterile space into something warmer. But there were bad days too. Days when pain confined her to bed, when her breathing grew labored, when the years of neglect manifested in ways that no amount of money or medical intervention could reverse. On one such evening, Victor sat beside her bed, reading aloud from To Kill a Mockingbird, her favorite novel, and one she had given him for his 13th birthday. Her eyes were closed, but he knew she was listening by the slight smile that curved her lips when he reached a particularly beloved passage. "You always did have a wonderful reading voice," she murmured when he paused to turn a page. "I used to love when you'd volunteer to read to the class." Victor smiled at the memory. "I only volunteered because you slipped me cookie when I did." She opened her eyes, twinkling with mischief. "A teacher uses whatever motivation works." They laughed together, but the moment was interrupted when Grace winced, a spasm of pain crossing her features. "Should I call the nurse?" Victor asked, immediately alert. She waved away his concern. "Just the usual aches, dear. Nothing to be done about it." Her expression grew more serious. "Victor, we need to talk about what happens next." "What do you mean?" "I mean I can't stay here forever, becoming a burden on your life." Victor set the book aside. "You're not a burden. You could never be a burden." "That's kind, but not realistic." Grace reached for his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You have a life. A business empire. I'm grateful for these weeks, for the chance to see you again, but—" "No," he interrupted, voice sharper than intended. "There's no but. This is your home now for as long as you want it." Grace studied him with the penetrating gaze that had always seen straight through his defenses. "What exactly are you running from, Victor?" The question caught him off guard. "Running from? I'm not running from anything. I'm trying to take care of you." "Are you?" she asked gently. "Or are you trying to make up for lost time by putting your life on hold?" Victor stood abruptly, moving to the window. Outside, the city glittered beneath a blanket of stars, millions of lives intersecting in their own complex patterns of connection and loss. "Maybe I am," he admitted finally. "Is that so wrong?" "It's not about right or wrong. It's about living truthfully." She paused, gathering strength. "You can't change the past, Victor. You can only learn from it." He turned back to face her, voice raw with emotion. "What if the lesson is that I've been living all wrong, that I've been chasing the wrong things, that I let the most important person in my life end up in a place like Pinehaven while I accumulated wealth I don't even enjoy?" Grace's expression softened. "Then the lesson isn't to swing to the other extreme. It's to find balance." What happens when the past we've ignored forces us to confront the people we've become? Will Victor find a way to reconcile his successful present with the forgotten debts of his past? The revelation came to Victor in the middle of a board meeting. He was halfway through a presentation on quarterly projections when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence, the words dying on his lips as clarity washed over him like a wave. The boardroom fell silent, executives exchanging concerned glances as their CEO stood frozen before the projection screen. "Mr. Reed," his CFO prompted after an uncomfortable moment. "Are you all right?" Victor blinked, seeing the room as if, for the first time, the polished mahogany table, the leather chairs, the men and women in expensive suits waiting for his next words. For years, this room had been the center of his universe. Now it felt like a theater set, two-dimensional and ultimately meaningless. "I need to make some changes," he said finally. "To the projections?" someone asked. to everything. He cancelled the remainder of the meeting and returned home, mind racing with possibilities. Grace was in the sunroom, a book open on her lap, the afternoon light gilding her silver hair. She looked up as he entered. "You're home early," she observed, marking her place with a ribbon. "Is something wrong?" "Actually, I think something is finally right." Victor sat beside her, energy radiating from him. "I've been thinking about what you said, about balance, about living truthfully." Grace waited patiently as he gathered his thoughts. "For years, I've been donating to charities, cutting checks for photo opportunities, thinking that was enough. But it's not. It's never been enough." He leaned forward, eyes intense. "Do you remember how you used to tell us that true education wasn't about learning facts, but about learning how to make a difference?" A smile touched her lips. "I remember. I want to make a real difference, starting with Pinehaven." Over the next several days, Victor threw himself into a new project with the same intensity he had once reserved for corporate takeovers. He purchased the nursing home property, allocated millions for renovations, and assembled a team of the best geriatric care specialists in the country to redesign the facility from the ground up. But that was just the beginning. One renovated nursing home doesn't solve the systemic problem, he explained to Grace over dinner one evening, spreading blueprints across the table. "So I'm creating a foundation, a real one, not a tax shelter, dedicated, and to elder care reform, starting with identifying former educators who have been forgotten by the system." Grace studied the plans, her eyes misty. "This is remarkable, Victor, but why educators specifically?" "Because teachers shape the future, but we abandon them to the past." He covered her hand with his. "Because you matter, Miss Grace. You all matter." For the first time in his career, Victor Reed became personally involved in his philanthropic efforts. He visited nursing homes across the city, sat with residents, listened to their stories. He learned names, remembered birthdays, showed up for small celebrations that meant the world to people who had grown accustomed to being forgotten. And everywhere he went, Grace accompanied him when her health permitted. The residents responded to her differently than they did to him. Where they saw him as a benefactor, they saw her as a peer, someone who understood their struggles intimately. Together, they formed a bridge between worlds that rarely intersected, the wealthy and the forgotten, the powerful and the vulnerable. The transformation wasn't lost on those who knew Victor. His executive team initially resisted his reduced schedule and new priorities, but as the months passed, something unexpected happened. The company's culture began to shift. Community involvement increased, employee satisfaction rose, even profits improved as the corporation gained a reputation for genuine social responsibility rather than performative philanthropy. 6 months after finding Grace at Pinehaven, Victor stood beside her at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly renovated facility, now renamed Wilson House in her honor. The dingy corridors had been replaced with bright, accessible spaces. The staff had doubled. Gardens bloomed where weeds had once grown. Most importantly, the residents carried themselves with new dignity, no longer hidden away, but celebrated as vital members of the community. As cameras flashed and officials made speeches, Victor leaned down to whisper in Grace's ear. "What do you think?" She squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes. "I think you've remembered what matters most." That evening, as they drove home through the autumn twilight, Grace grew unusually quiet. Victor noticed her watching the city lights with a peculiar intensity, as if committing them to memory. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She turned to him with a smile that held both sadness and peace. "Everything is exactly as it should be, dear. I'm just a bit tired from all the excitement." Will the foundation Victor has built survive the storms yet to come? And as Grace's health continues to decline, can Victor find the strength to honor her legacy in the most meaningful way? Victor knew something was wrong the moment he entered Grace's room the next morning. She sat in the chair by the window, already dressed for the day, but her complexion had a grayish tinge, and her breathing seemed more labored than usual. "I've already called the doctor," she said before he could speak, her voice weaker than the day before. No need to worry, but the doctor's expression after examining her told a different story. In the hallway outside her room, he delivered the news Victor had been dreading. Her heart is failing. The excitement yesterday was likely too much. "But there must be something. Specialists, treatments," Victor began. The familiar feeling of being able to solve any problem with enough money rising within him. The doctor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Reed, we've explored every avenue. At this point, it's about making her comfortable and respecting her wishes." "And what are her wishes?" Victor asked, though he already knew the answer. "She wants to stay here with you, no hospitals." After the doctor left, Victor sat beside Grace's bed, holding her frail hand as she dozed. How was it possible that in just 6 short months, this woman had rewritten the story of his life? How had he ever forgotten her? When she awoke, her eyes found his immediately, as if she had sensed his presence even in sleep. "Don't look so gloomy," she chided softly. "I've had a wonderful life." "It should have been better," he replied, voice thick with emotion. "I should have been there. You're here now." She squeezed his hand. "And look at all you've done, all you're doing. That's what matters." They spent the day quietly, Grace too weak to move much, but insistent on being in the sunroom rather than confined to bed. Victor cancelled all his appointments, refusing to leave her side. They reminisced about the past, her teaching days, his childhood antics, the small moments that had shaped them both. As evening fell, casting long shadows across the room, Grace turned to him with sudden urgency. "Victor, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he replied without hesitation. "Promise me you won't let this," she gestured vaguely around them, "become about guilt. Promise me you'll find joy again." Victor struggled to reply, throat constricting with unshed tears. "You've always been too hard on yourself," she continued, her voice growing softer. "Even as a boy, remember how upset you were when you got that B+ in history?" Despite everything, he laughed at the memory. "You made me write an essay about the value of imperfection, and it was the best thing you ever wrote." Her eyes held his, intense despite her waning strength. "Life isn't about achieving perfection, Victor. It's about embracing our humanity, flaws and all." That night, as a gentle snow began to fall over the city, Grace slipped away peacefully in her sleep, Victor's hand still clasped in hers. The grief that followed was unlike anything he had experienced before, raw and all-encompassing. For days, he moved through his penthouse like a ghost, surrounded by the books she had loved, the small touches she had added that had transformed a house into a home. Her funeral was simple, but attended by hundreds, former students, colleagues, residents from Wilson House, and many others whose lives she had touched, gathered to celebrate a woman who had given so much and asked for so little in return. Victor stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, and found himself at a loss for words. How could he possibly capture what Grace Wilson had meant to him? How could he express the depth of her impact, not just on his success, but on his soul? In the end, he spoke not of his regrets or her accomplishments, but of her lessons. The way she taught him to see beauty in the ordinary, to find strength in vulnerability, to measure wealth not in dollars, but in connections. Grace Wilson didn't just teach subjects, he concluded, voice steady despite his grief. She taught humanity. And in her final months, she taught me the most important lesson of all, that it's never too late to come home to yourself. After the service, as the mourners dispersed into the winter afternoon, a young teacher approached Victor timidly. "Miss Wilson was my mentor when I first started teaching," she explained, twisting her hands nervously. "She always spoke of you with such pride." Victor looked at her in surprise. "She spoke of me?" The woman nodded. "All the time. She kept a scrapbook about your achievements. She would tell us, 'See that man, he was one of mine. Remember that each child you teach might change the world someday.'" Something broke and healed simultaneously in Victor's heart. All those years he had forgotten her. She had been remembering him, celebrating him, using his story to inspire others. In the weeks that followed, Victor retreated from public life to process his grief. But unlike the driven workaholic of before, who would have buried emotion beneath ambition, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss, and, with it, the profound gratitude for having found Grace again, however briefly. When he finally returned to Wilson House for the first time since her passing, he was surprised to find himself greeted not with condolences, but with joy. The residents welcomed him as one of their own, sharing stories of how Grace had spoken about him during her visits, how proud she had been of the man he had become. It was there, sitting in the garden that now bloomed where weeds had once grown, that Victor made his final promise to Grace. He would continue the work they had begun together, but not from guilt or regret, from love, from purpose, from the understanding that true legacy isn't built on monuments or fortunes, but on lives touched and hearts changed. 1 year to the day after finding Grace at Pinehaven, Victor Reed stood before a different kind of audience than he was accustomed to. Not shareholders or executives, but teachers gathered for the inaugural Grace Wilson Education Summit. The foundation he had established in her memory had already funded improvements in dozens of facilities for elderly educators, created mentorship programs connecting retired teachers with new ones, and established scholarships for students entering the education field. Grace Wilson once told me that education isn't about learning facts, but about learning how to make a difference, he began, looking out at the faces turned toward him, young and old, all united by the calling that had defined Grace's life. "She made a difference in my life, though it took me far too long to recognize it. Today, we honor not just her memory, but her mission." As he spoke, Victor caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the room, an elderly man he recognized from Wilson House, watching with tears streaming unchecked down his weathered cheeks, and in that moment Victor understood with perfect clarity what Grace had been trying to teach him all along. Success wasn't measured in the empires you built, but in the lives you touched. Wealth wasn't counted in dollars, but in connections. And it was never, ever too late to remember what truly mattered, to come home to the person you were meant to be. Every day, I ask myself what Grace would think of the choices I'm making, Victor concluded, his voice strong with conviction. Not because I fear her disappointment, but because I've learned that the greatest tribute we can pay to those who shaped us is to live with the same compassion that they showed us. To pass on what they gave us, to remember. Outside, the spring sun broke through clouds, casting golden light across the assembled educators, those who shaped the future one child at a time, those whose impact often went unnoticed until years later, if acknowledged at all. Victor Reed, once defined solely by his business acumen, now stood among them not as a benefactor, but as a student, still learning, still growing, still striving to honor the greatest teacher he had ever known. And somewhere, he liked to think, Grace Wilson was watching, and she was proud. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.